Welcome to Interdish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. When it comes to thinking about the future of food, is it possible to reimagine our individual and collective appetites around what we want it to be? Taste is subjective, of course, but it's also deeply embedded into the land, histories, politics, and sociocultural dynamics that we navigate throughout our lives. And as my guest this week, Alicia Kennedy, writes, tastes are also shaped by how we value or don't value ingredients in their own histories. Alicia is a writer from Long Island. She is the author of No Meat Required, The Cultural History and Culinary Future of Plant-Based Eating, and On Eating, The Making and Unmaking of My Appetites, which is out officially as of today through Hachette. Her newsletter From the Desk covers food, culture, politics, and media, and she has just launched Tomato Tomato, a literary journal of food writing. Alicia's back on the show today to speak about On Eating, exploring the process of weaving the personal and cultural histories of ingredients through her chapters, the interrogation of early appetites and their influence on her food writing, the dynamics of feminine appetites in food media, and the importance of properly considering the labor of growing and producing food as a way to unpack Western appetites. Here's my conversation with Alicia. Welcome back to the show, Alicia. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm great. How are you?
I'm great. I'm looking forward to connecting. And before we kind of jump into today's conversation, do you mind sharing a little bit of background about who you are, where you're coming in from today, and the type of work that you do?
I am a food and culture writer. I am from Long Island, but I'm right now in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I write. I'm always the worst person at giving a description of my own work because I'm horrified by it. But I not horrified by the work that I do, but horrified by describing it. But I am a writer, food writer.
I definitely understand that. But you really write, I would say too, right?
Well, yes, it's how I make a living for the last 11 years. So yes, I do quite a bit of writing, yes.
So one thing that really struck me with On Eating is everything feels so embedded in the topics that you're discussing. There's these personal histories, there's these broader histories of the lands that you're looking at, but it's very naturally embedded, which to me, as I was reading, I was like, this must have been a lot of research to get it to this point. So can you kind of walk us through what that process was like to make it intertwine so beautifully like that?
Well, I appreciate you saying that because a lot of the book was based on research I've already done. So it was more about making it feel a little bit more immediate, like both lived in and immediate, because I don't want people reading a book and feeling bored or that I have already become so, that the information is sort of overdone. You want it to feel organic and like the personal and the political and cultural and kind of gastronomic elements of it are all working together, but at the same time feel alive while you're reading them. So I would say it's interesting because I do think the subtext of those connections in each chapter came about organically. I'm like a very intuitive writer, and I don't think I know things until I am writing. I think I'm processing things all the time by externalizing them, whether it is writing or talking. And so the chapter I actually did the most research for was the apple chapter because I hadn't written about apples before. And so I read so much and so much and so much to do that. And it's a natural origin point for the book, and it's a natural origin point for life, right? So that makes sense. And then other things were a little bit more difficult to make work, I guess. Chocolate was a difficult chapter because of how much I had to try to explain, but also because I was explaining a personal history for myself that I don't necessarily understand. And so I had a lot of conversations with my editor about that. And for me, with memoir, I don't want the reader to feel like I have figured it all out. I do want it to feel for the reader a little bit more real, where it's like, I don't know what happened. I don't know why I did that. There are clues to futures in the bad decisions or the strange decisions that we make, or the strange responses that we have to different scenarios and situations that we have that don't make sense. And so I did want some of that in the book, that we aren't always making sense to ourselves, and we aren't always making sense to the world. And so that chapter was really, really, I think, the most difficult chapter to write because I was trying to explain a history that I don't particularly comprehend about myself. You know, if I was able to write that chapter specifically about just chocolate, I would have been so happy. And like, and to not explain anything about, you know, there's like a relationship backstory to it. I would have really been happy to not talk about that at all. But at the same time, it would have been really hard to explain, like, why was I living on Long Island still? Why was I baking cookies and going to yoga obsessively? And why was I desperate to do something with my hands because I was like so bored with both my job and like the decisions I'd made that got me there. And so I have to have some sort of love for those bad decisions because they led me ultimately to everything else in my life that I actually wanted. But at the same time, that's really hard to communicate to people, right? Which is
Yeah.
that like, yeah, all of these really seemingly odd things that I did are intertwined with love and longing and chocolate and, you know, Willy Wonka and like ballet class and recitals and yada yada yada. But that chapter for me was the most difficult to write because of how I hadn't necessarily processed my decision making then. So I was really doing it in real time and intertwining all of that with this good that is so important globally and how that all intertwined was really difficult. It was a question of craft, I guess, of writing craft and not of research necessarily. Because again, for most of these chapters, I had either lived the reporting or lived the research, and I wasn't necessarily doing it in real time other than to get updates on things like, you know, what are the latest stats on wheat and what are the latest things about beans and what are the, you know, and so other than getting like updated statistics and updated, you know, I don't know, temperatures,
Mhm.
it like literal temperatures
Yeah.
of things. You know, and so with that, those things were sort of easier for me to write because I had embedded them in my story already. Whereas in my own head, the chocolate of how it affected my trajectory as a human, as a baker, as a writer, that I was comfortable with, but I wasn't comfortable yet with the personal narrative of it where it went hand in hand with this long relationship that I didn't process and didn't understand. So that was kind of the work of that chapter. And everything else really fell into place. I think my favorite chapter to write, frankly, was the plantain chapter because I
Mm.
felt so I was dealing with things in it, but it was a lot of stuff that I hadn't yet articulated, but that also felt really good to connect with and to connect with the plantain specifically because plantains are so associated with Puerto Rico but aren't Puerto Rican in terms of their origin point. And getting into that, that was really, I felt really like alive in that chapter and I really enjoyed that. But I think that my own personal history and living in San Juan really came together in that chapter kind of perfectly. But it's interesting because I definitely see the book in my head, the book is in two parts, which
Mm.
is the introduction through martinis and then mushrooms through the end is the second part. And for me in my head structurally, I was very much thinking of it as the making and the unmaking, which is the subtitle, the overwrought subtitle that my mother has made fun of.
Oh.
But like because it does sound so like intense. But I do think like it's very much here's who I am with all of the influences of where I come from, and here is who I've decided to make myself be. And so that is very like obviously there's elements of both in both sides of it, but for me, I was very much thinking of the book as structured as this kind of hill that we go on and walk through.
Yeah, and it feels like that. Like you can very much feel that shift. You can feel the energy shift and like how you're talking about it, how you're exposing the personal narrative in it. It's very visceral. So
Yeah, it becomes much lighter too.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm curious too. There's a specific moment where you're talking about taking philosophy classes and you're also working at a coffee shop, which for me felt very, I know you don't like the word relatable, but that was one of those like, oh yeah, I've been there too. But can you kind of talk through some of the knots that you started to untie through that, be it, you know, in the actual experience or like afterward making sense of it?
Yeah, no, I love the fact that that was such an important part of my life. And I don't know if I had articulated it until I had to kind of create the narrative around it, which is that, you know, this contemporary philosophy class where the professor was a former Jesuit Marxist, and like told all of us basically that we were meant for the professional managerial class, PMC. That's what we were meant to be.
Okay.
We didn't have that acronym then, but he was basically like telling all of us we were mediocre and we were just there for the tuition money. And I felt like that was like, it hurt me in the moment. And but he was right. And then, we were reading Herbert Marcuse's One Dimensional Man, and it was very critical of technology. And I was like, no, I love technology. At that moment in my life, I was like, no, technology is like all I have. And so, it was very formative for me in that it got me thinking about class in a real way. And it got me thinking about, the systemic structures in which life puts us. And I mean, for me, for the high school I went to a Catholic high school on Long Island, a Franciscan high school. Going to Fordham was for us going to community college. Like,
Mm,
even though it
okay.
was one of the better universities around, but there were a lot of people from my high school who went there, so I kind of knew that I was sort of just like shunted into a very specific pathway, which was supposed to be toward being a lawyer, but I did not become a lawyer.
Wild. Yeah.
And so I just had this complicated relationship with what I was supposed to be doing in life, especially because in school there was, of course, very much this idea that we're in college and we're supposed to be focused on solely on our classes. And because of changes that happened in my family structure when I was in college, had to like work two jobs to pay for my car payment and pay for whatever I had to pay for. And so it was taking this philosophy class, and then before I was going to philosophy class, I spent like 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. working the drive-through at the Starbucks.
Yep.
So, and like those two experiences were very formative for me in terms of how they taught me a lot, and like a lot of the other people I was working with at Starbucks, they would like, and this tells you a lot about my relationship to work, which is that no matter what, I don't like it. They were like, I love my work now, but like in terms of like the idea of having to do things is like so antithetical to how my brain works, which I've been allowed to be, which is a huge privilege. But my other coworkers were also in school and also working. And it was like at Fordham, I felt like I was the only person who had a job while I was going to school. And when I was at Starbucks, I was like, oh, there's actually a lot of people who are living
Mm.
like this. But they're also like desperate for money. They're like working double shifts. And I was like, you will never find me working a double shift here. Like, I don't. But I was also making money doing web design, like sort of freelance. So I was making more money doing that than working at Starbucks, obviously. But for me, it was just very like a weird experience of learning about class in a much realer and more intense way than I had ever thought about it before. Because of course, when I was a kid, we were, perfectly middle class people. And I went to Catholic school, which other people think is fancy, but like it wasn't fancy
It's
then.
not
It's not
fancy. It's
fancy.
not fancy
And,
at all.
when people go to public school for whatever reason, or like when I talk to people on Long Island now and I'm like, oh yeah, I went to St. Anthony's, they're like, oh, and it's like, what the hell? Like, I was in school with Franciscan monks. Like,
Yeah.
not everybody parents had a ton of money. I realized it when I was like, oh, everyone's going to Abercrombie. So like we went to Abercrombie and my mom was like, these clothes are expensive. And I was like, then why is everyone else wearing like that was, and then like when everyone got a car in senior year and like I had a 1982 BMW 320i, which was a very cool vintage car to me. But everyone else came in with like a new Mercedes. And I was like, is this life? Like, what is going on?
That's wild. Yeah.
And I had thought about class in high school in that way, where I was like, oh, these kids have a lot of money or whatever. But then when I got to college, I experienced it in a much realer way simply because I was the one trying to like make my own ends meet in some sort of way. Anyway, long story to say that the experience of like wage labor and in a real way of like, oh, I have bills to pay, plus going to this school where it seemed like no one expected me to have that responsibility, was like that tension was really, really, it was just very formative for me, that tension, to exist in that tension. And the philosophy professor gave more words to it and more shape to it for me. Obviously the right wing is like everyone goes to college and becomes a Marxist, and like for me, sure, yeah, but like it just kind of opened my eyes to all these things, and I think that's what college is supposed to do, right? And for me, like that class, the contemporary philosophy class, and like this feminist American poetry class were were like the two things that just totally blew my mind, and also a critical theory class. And those are the three classes that are like still relevant to my work now. But at the time, it was just very mind blowing and very difficult to wrap my head around all of these things. But it was really, really necessary. And like, as I write in the book, when I was getting ready for graduation and they gave us all these questionnaires about like, where are you planning to work? I was like, Starbucks.
Amazing.
Because
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah.
fuck you. And
I
your like
know.
weird expectations that I don't already have a job, or that like I'm supposed to be interning and working for free and all of these things. And it's like, I don't have the luxury of doing that. And not everyone does. But it was very, very important to me to have that experience, even if at the moment it was, of course, a struggle and like exhausting. But yeah.
I can't imagine your writing without it because the labor focus is so within everything that you do. Even if it's not like surface level, it's always kind of snuck in there as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I try. I try.
So I wanted to talk a little bit too about appetites. Obviously, that's a big feature in this. And you explored the idea of women's appetites, particularly in food writing. And I thought it was such a fascinating point that you're making about, especially at least by like the 2000s, this need for women to be adopting these more masculine appetites in order to be valued. Do
Yeah.
you think, given the fracturing of the food media landscape and the media landscape at large and everything that's happening, what sorts of appetites are valued for women writers today?
I think it hasn't really changed, because I think while we have a lot more of the domestic doyens or whatever, or recipe developers, it's so meat centric. Like, you cannot be a very famous or important recipe developer cookbook author without meat, really. Like, Hetty McKinnon is, to my mind, the only exception to this in the United States, where she does plant-based food. She doesn't talk about that, doesn't really call it vegetarian. It simply is. And I think that her approach has shown that it is possible to be relevant and be vegetarian. But for the most part, I've spent my career having a lot of drinks with other food writers, usually women, who are like secret vegans or secret vegetarians or secret pescatarians. And they don't talk about it or really write about it, because once you kind of get this label of being the vegan food writer or the vegetarian food writer, you don't get taken as seriously. Obviously, like, my entire project has been to kind of make a different situation for that, but I don't think it actually exists. I think that, especially in the US, everyone is in complete and utter denial of the role of industrial animal agriculture in climate change. And that just affects everything. I mean, when I'm getting emails from New York Times Cooking, or I'm scrolling Apple News and looking at the food content, it is all chicken, chicken, chicken still, beef, etc. And it's just, for me, I just feel as though we're all being gaslit into, I mean, and I talk about water in the book, and the water usage of industrial animal agriculture is like magnitudes more than generative AI. Not that people should not be doing generative AI either, but the conversation around that, I find, is so much more in depending on which circles you're running in. The conversation around that is a lot more strong and forceful, and I feel the conversation around sustainability in fashion is a lot more strong and forceful.
Yeah.
But in food, we are in this infancy or this adolescence in terms of food writing, where we are just repeating the same thing over and over. And I don't think that it's okay still to be a vegetarian or vegan food writer, especially as a woman. In my darkest and most resentful and like egoistic moments, I always wonder, like, how would people respond to my work if I were a man? Like, and that is a lot for me. Is wondering what my career and my life would look like if I were a man, and if I were vegan, and I were, able to express things the way that I do. How would people respond to that? How much more money would I be making? And so, like, I just still think that it's irrelevant, and not as relevant as it should be, the conversation around eating animals. And I also think that, until there is a vegetarian or vegan male food writer who does it and is brash about it, I don't think the conversation will change. And maybe that's just me being an asshole, but I do think that it's still the same. It's still oh, it's very niche to be vegan or vegetarian. You don't know what good food is if you're vegan or vegetarian. You're keeping yourself out of a lot of conversations if you're doing this. And I'm just like, I just don't want to contribute to a massive problem. And I've shied away a lot in my work from talking about animal rights, specifically because it's not my lane, really. Like, I am a food writer. Food is what I talk about. Food is what I care about. But I also know that it's just to talk, if I was to really get into that side of things, people would definitely not listen to me. Like, but it's also people close their ears when you start talking about human labor in the meat processing
Yeah.
industry. Like, in your logical brain says, oh, if you know how bad this industry is for the people working in it, not just the animals, you would care. But people don't. It doesn't matter how bad it is for the environment, how bad it is for the workers, that animals are held in these horrifying conditions and fed a diet that they're not supposed to eat. It just doesn't matter. Like, nothing moves the needle on people's relationship to having meat all the time. And, for me, that's just the ultimate challenge of my job, I guess. But I think in this book, I'm not as intense about it as I was in No Meat Required. And so I hope that it helps. I hope it helps that I write a lot in this book about how much I loved eating lamb. And so I'm hoping that that helps people to be like, oh, maybe, like, because a lot of what I want to do with this book is make people think about their own appetites and their own formative appetite, and how whether or not the way they eat is reflective of the world they want to live in.
Yeah.
And I think if the memoir has an overarching goal beyond being good writing, it's that. If the reader comes away from it with this new sense of what their own appetite means to their own life, that's meaningful to me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting argument too that you're posing with that. And I think, when you're talking about the more plant-specific ingredients throughout the book, you make this distinction of how they're harder to commodify because you can shape them in luxury in some settings, and then they're also, foods that you eat when you're stretching your budget as well. So can you talk about what factors into making plant foods stretch between these categories and how people can shape appetites around that as
Yeah.
well?
Oof. I mean, it's hard because even, yesterday we have this new shop in Old San Juan, and I got some oyster mushrooms there. And I got 8 ounces of oyster mushrooms, and I spent almost $12 on them. And then I was like, oof. I'm like, we can't eat mushrooms every day. And it's like, they're basic mushrooms. But I was just like, that's expensive for, like, when you sear them off. And I made like a sort of mushroom shawarma with them, and it doesn't amount to that much. It's sort of like when you throw the bag of spinach in the pan and it
Yeah,
shrinks to
yeah.
like nothing, and they're delicious and it's fabulous. But I was like, wow, I understand why people wouldn't, make this a normal part of their diet. Of course, if you get the agaricus, like the portobello or the button mushrooms, they're more affordable. And so those you can definitely make more a regular part of your diet, even in San Juan where everything is wildly expensive. But, with these plant foods, it's hard because, meat has the stature it does in many cultures because it's a food of affluence. If you have a lot of it and a lot of access to it, that means that you're doing well. And so it's very tied to that feeling of satiation and that feeling of like, I am comfortable. If I have meat, I am comfortable. It fulfills a very, very like human desire to not feel scarcity, despite the fact that it is causing scarcity in so many ways. And then, but with plant foods, because they can, as you're saying, kind of play these dual roles. Like the matsutake can cost a couple $100s a pound. The truffles cost God knows how much money. I love truffle. And then, then you have the portobellos that cost very little and are very easy to cultivate, et cetera, et cetera. And, every cookbook tells you agaricus kind of sucks. Like the portobellos really kind of suck. I love a portobello mushroom.
Me too. I miss them.
But
They're not as, like, popular as they were, and it's harder to find them,
yeah,
but they're
it's like,
so good.
bring them back. I
I
know.
know.
I love it. Like, just, yeah, anyway, but it's this constant push and pull between people love a luxury good. Like, we do. We love a nice thing. It is what it is. And so when the mushroom is this affordable thing and maybe it shrinks down and it doesn't fill you up as much, or or beans. Like, people love their fancy Rancho Gordo beans or whatever it might be, but, they might turn their nose up at like buying a can of Goya beans. Meanwhile, like I'm constantly doing both and I think that's fine.
Yeah.
And I also have like really nice tofu sometimes, and most of the time eat whatever the hell is at the supermarket, But because of the diversity inherent to plant foods, and obviously, like in the last 150 years, our diets have gotten so undiverse, like in as human beings, and biodiversity is being destroyed the world over. But because plant foods are so diverse, because you have so many varieties of all of these things, whether they're mushrooms or beans or bananas or everything. You can't commodify them in the same way, and anyone who does is kind of an asshole, I think. But if you cannot, take ownership of a black bean, like you save the seed and everyone can have grow black beans. You can grow these things in your yard, and so they become less, they take on less cachet, culturally speaking, and so thus it's just more difficult to make people want things that straddle these lines, and so it's difficult because you don't want to make beans a luxury item because they're important for everybody to eat. And so it's more just about in the preparation, how do you find the specialness in a can of beans versus a fancy heirloom bean? And how do you find the specialness in a portobello, even when it's not a maitake that someone foraged, And so, of course, a lot of these foods you can find for free in many cases. And so, what's the meaning of that? And like, we have this real weird relationship, especially in the United States, to foraging and to free food. The idea
Yeah.
of the earth giving you food for free is really weird to people. That also happens in San Juan because once there was a breadfruit tree growing. There's a breadfruit tree that grows next to a supermarket here, and if you park on the top, you can like get a breadfruit. And a
Sweet.
woman yelled at me once when I was trying to take one, and she was like, "You can go in the supermarket and maybe buy one." And it's
What?
like, there's a breadfruit right here. No one's going to eat it. It's going to fall in the parking lot,
Totally.
And like, but people have this very weird relationship to like food that is just growing freely around them and that sort of a thing, or foraging. Like it's very weird and maybe dirty to people. And that has a whole history that I talk about a little bit in the book. But I think that that also affects how people think about their food. And, it's like foraging is cool if you're going to Noma and spending $1,500, but like, is foraging cool when you're just taking a piece of fruit from your neighbor's yard? I don't know. Like, so
Yeah.
it's all these differences in the cachet levels that happen with plants is very, very interesting, and it's very difficult to untangle because it's really rooted in so much nature, but it's also rooted in so much nurture of like how our cultures tell us to value things, which is
Yeah.
so it's difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think often about America and Canada being very young, culturally speaking,
Yes.
in terms of
Yeah.
how we think about food, how we think about everything. And toward the end of the book, you've got this line that just, when I read it, I was like, whoa, um, where you're talking about, this American promise of an abundance from nowhere, touched by no hands. And it really spoke to this idea of smoothing individual Western appetites, as you've been talking about throughout this. So, do you think, since writing the book, since exploring this ability to create and change and shift appetites, do you think that, generally speaking, people are capable of making these changes to what they eat or even what they start to consider as luxuries?
I think they are, and I think that it just requires so much more pushing than we're doing. And I'm talking about like media makers, desire makers. We have to kind of make things desirable because that's how the International Panel on Climate Change from the UN talks about it, which is plant-based foods have to become more desirable. And
Mm,
I'm always like, whose job is that? It's food writers' job to do that. And I think the fact that we're not taking it seriously enough is a huge mistake on obviously a globally catastrophic level and so a lot for me in my own work is just about making it desirable, making it normal, making it seem easy to do, which for me it is. But I also know, there's so many studies, like there are people for whom they're going to be more adept or more likely to go vegetarian or vegan or whatever it might be. And it's a lot about our psychology. It's a lot about, how comfortable you are with being different from other people and how comfortable you are, with with, or how even how left leaning your politics are naturally, or how right leaning your politics are naturally, is going to influence how much of a tolerance you have for changing your diet against the norm of the culture. So basically the problem or the solution is to change the norms of the culture, right? And I do think that we underestimate how powerful it can be to simply make a different choice, or in terms of what we choose to give to people is desirable in the media. Like if we just don't give them chicken every day, they're not going to want chicken every day.
Yeah.
Like I think it's so easy. Like, and the fact is, a lot of there was a big piece in New York Magazine recently that was saying, oh, veganism is kind of out now because fascist meat is
Yeah.
in and stuff, and red meat's in, and the keto diet and carnivores and yada yada yada. And it's like, well, that's because that's what everyone is telling people.
Yeah.
There's this huge media push from social media to media being like, how much protein do you need? How much meat? And like, if we just kind of did a big push where it was like, how to eat beans 25 ways. I don't know. And then the push was more like that, and like how to make tofu delicious today, how to do tempeh, the XYZ. I think, and without making a big statement about it, because making a statement is antithetical to changing people's minds, people are going to change their minds because we're very freaking simple creatures, frankly, at the end of the day. Like, people aren't obsessed. Of course, we have some deep-seated human desires, etc. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of culture and a lot of nurture and a lot of like, what is everyone else around me doing? What's cool around me? I mean, I'm always thinking about sharing Clueless, being like, if we just get in the kitchen and rearrange a few things, like we can really shift how we're talking about these things. And so for me, it's like such a no-brainer to just talk about them differently. I have been a little angry lately in my work for sure about meat, where I've just been like, can everyone just get a grip, please? And just
Yeah. But it's so much lately too.
it's so much, but I think people just don't, people are really, it's hard, and it's hard, like people don't want someone preaching at them, and I feel like I have fallen into a little bit of preachiness lately, because I'm exhausted by
Mhm.
how hard it is to get this narrative, like this truth across to people, which is that industrial animal agriculture is like a massive part of killing the planet, and we have to talk about that. And it doesn't really, you can't regenerative ag your way out of the amount of meat that people are
Mhm.
obsessed with consuming. And so, it has to be this shift in this volume and in this relationship to meat. How do we actually make that happen? And it's hard. It's hard to talk about without feeling like you're tearing your hair out, but it's necessary because again, people do, especially in the US, it's, you are just promised this abundance from nowhere, touched by no hands, that you never have to think about, that and it's like, no, actually the chickens are coming home to roost in terms of climate change. It's time to have this conversation in a real way, but we'll see.
Yeah. Well, it's also one of those things. I mean, like on the radio the other day here, there was some like food price report that came out where they were talking about, surprise, surprise, the price of beef has increased exponentially in Canada. And so they were lamenting that they were going to have to pay more while other foods were actually decreasing in cost. So, and it was like lentils, pulses, things like that. So I was
Yeah.
just screaming at the radio in my car. It's right there.
It's hard. It's
It's
hard.
hard. Yeah. But I was going to say, like, I appreciate your voice in this as this, like, constant reminder, because that's somewhere where, people can tune in and have that push, have that reminder. I know it's a lot as one person,
Yeah.
but I definitely appreciate that you're
Thank
consistent with
you.
that messaging.
Yeah. And even when the vegans get mad, it's okay, because they hate vegetarians too.
It's tricky space.
It's very tricky. It's very, very tricky. Yeah, anyway. I saw that Ricky Martin went vegetarian and PETA posted about it. And then there's people in the comments being like, he's just a vegetarian. And it's like, if everyone went vegetarian, I mean, we could fix a lot of things,
Could do a lot. Yeah.
We could do a lot. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. But yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me.
Thank you.
Do you mind sharing where people can get On Eating and check you out online if they want to learn more?
Yes, you can get On Eating anywhere books are sold. There are signed copies available from Kitchen Arts and Letters in New York City, which does ship internationally. And my newsletter is aliciakennedy.news.
So I'll have that all linked. Thank you so much, Alicia.
Thank you.
That was Alicia Kennedy. I've linked her book On Eating, her newsletter, Tomato, and her social media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at our website at anthodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthodish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you listen in. If you like the show, please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help get the word out. For more Anthodish, sign up for my newsletter at sarahduignan.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky at Anthodish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you're learning about food. Music production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. Anthodish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.